Welcome to the Balance Sheet, where you rise above the noise and learn about the most important business issues of our age. I'm your host and fellow student, Conrad Chua. It's been 50 days since the Labour government won the UK elections. While PM Keir Starmer had to cancel his summer holidays because of the riots in parts of the UK, it's going to be the economy that will occupy much of his in-tray in the years ahead. There's been a lot written about what's going wrong in the UK economy, but to help us make sense of this, we have Professor Simon Deakin, Director of the Centre for Business Research here at Cambridge Judge Business School. Simon is a Fellow of the British Academy and has received academic prizes for his research on corporate governance. So welcome, Simon.
Hi, Conrad. Hi, everybody. Very nice to be with you today.
Simon, could you give us that 30,000 feet overview of the UK economy?
Yeah, so the first thing to think about is that the UK is almost the world's oldest industrial economy. We were the first to have an industrial revolution, and that's still a legacy, which is both good and bad. Okay, I don't think the UK is any longer a leading manufacturing power, but the UK is still very important for the world economy in a number of respects. We've moved away from manufacturing to a focus on services over time. If you think about financial services and legal services, the UK would definitely be regarded as a world leader. The UK is very, very good at basic science and at the commercialization of science in areas like AI. People based in the UK and to some degree UK companies have been at the forefront of machine learning and developments like that. We're very good at university business links and taking basic research into the economy and the business world. So the UK economy has evolved over time and is no longer the only industrial nation. Of course, other nations catch up, but the UK has evolved and in some respects is very distinctive. It perhaps lacks some of the large manufacturing companies or production companies you would see in mainland Europe. It has nothing like the huge platform companies that we see in the United States or China, but the UK has big companies and very successful ones in areas like pharma and also, as I said, in services, in banking, and in a number of high-tech areas like chemicals. So the UK is slightly unusual because of its history and position, but yes, it's true we hear a lot of bad things about the UK. That's just because our news is always dominated by things that might not be going right. We don't always hear about the things that do go right.
And for our viewers, if you have any questions throughout the live stream, just pop them in the comments field. But Simon, you've given us that overview of the UK economy and the different sectors and their relative importance. What is the current state of the UK economy now?
Well, if we think about things which may be problems, most economists would say that the UK has a productivity problem. And that's reflected in relatively low wages and in fact in wages and salaries being stagnant for large parts of the working population since the global financial crisis of around about 2008, 2009. So productivity, it's important to understand, is about the relationship between inputs and outputs. So it's about what you're getting out of each hour's input of work or labour and also what you're getting for the capital that you invest. Why is productivity in the UK lower than it is in mainland Europe or in the United States? One answer to that would be a lack of investment. So again, most economists would say, especially since 2008, 2009, there has been less investment into key areas of the economy, production and manufacturing and new technologies. Right? Less private investment. There's a public investment, partly through the universities, but less private investment. What else is not going completely according to plan? The UK over time has become heavily dependent on sectors like real estate for growth. And so you see this in speculation over house prices and other real estate investments. And some economists would wonder whether this is really a productive strategy long term for any country. Right? So if capital or credit is leaching out into real estate speculation, that's not very productive for the long term. And some people think that's what's been happening again since 2008, 2009. The Bank of England responds to the global financial crisis through quantitative easing. There's a huge amount of credit flowing into the economy that way through the banks. but rather than being invested productively, much of it's gone into speculation. So we see in this country the social downside of that: very high house prices, lots of speculation in both the commercial and the residential sector, becoming more difficult to live and work in the south of England because of this. So there are imbalances in the UK economy because we have a low labour productivity rate in this country. It means that people work longer to produce the same amount of goods and or services, and they're not perhaps working as productively per hour, and that means that they may not be actually working in jobs which are as interesting or as sustainable. So very long working hours is a feature of the UK structure. Also, a lot of precarious work or so-called flexible work, low-paid work. Right, we have a minimum wage in this country, but we don't have what many European countries have, which is effective collective bargaining through trade unions and employers negotiating pay at sector level. Union membership has gone right down in this country since the 1980s, and the coverage of collective bargaining has considerably fallen. And that tends to mean there's a greater wage distribution, more inequality. Practically, what it means is that you have a large number of lower paid workers in a given country. The state has to come in and top up those incomes to produce a living income, which it does through what we call the universal credit system, previously tax credits, child tax credits, and family credits, housing benefit. Right? Okay, all these things are means-tested benefits which compensate for relatively precarious work and low pay. And so there's a burden on the public sector because of this. So public expenditure is greater than it would be if we had higher productivity. So productivity is a problem, especially for people working in the UK. Is the UK attractive, especially to overseas capital, because it's a relatively low wage country? Not necessarily. What matters is not nominal wages, but real wages taking account of productivity. So all the evidence is that foreign direct investment flows to countries with a well-trained labour force, which is also productive, and also, of course, a country which respects property rights. That's very important. Has a rule of law. The UK has a great advantage there in having a very stable environment for investment. Right, okay, so within Europe that may not make much difference, but globally the UK remains a focus for foreign direct investment, partly because it has many advantages, an extremely good and also flexible legal system, which is also a major source of exports of services. We're very successful. So we're very successful at finance, very successful at law, and in parts of manufacturing. But our domestic economy is perhaps not delivering for the people who live and work in this country.
These are long-standing issues of that low productivity. So why has it been so difficult to raise productivity in the UK?
Productivity is affected by a number of things, but I think it's affected by regulation to a large extent. So what we see in this country at the moment is so-called capital shallowing. So labour is replacing capital. We have a relatively cheap labour and relatively expensive capital. The cost of capital is high for productive investment, although it's quite easily available for capital's easily available for speculation, but not so much for productive investment. That's a problem. So capital shallowing implies that there's less capital invested per unit of labour input, and that's a significant problem. That's partly because labour is too cheap. Now you might think labour can't be too cheap, but it can be. There are not the right incentives to invest. I think in this situation where we don't have effective labour regulation, labour is too cheap and capital is actually too expensive. Why is that? Part of the corporate governance revolution, which I've written about, which begins really in the 1990s, is putting greater stress on shareholder rights and the ability of investors to hold managers to account. And the theory behind that is it would drive down the cost of capital. But I don't think that's the case. And in fact, the cost of capital, real capital for real productive investment, has gone up because firms are increasingly sensitive to the need to return capital to shareholders in the forms of share buybacks and high dividend payments. And those high dividends and share buybacks mean less money is going into productive investment. And this is a problem which affects the entire listed company sector. So even very successful companies listed in the UK have to pay very close attention to the need, as it's seen, to return capital to investors who actually, as shareholders, may not have invested in the original productive capacity of the firm at all. These shares are traded on a public exchange. It is not just a problem for the UK. It's also a problem for the United States. We see the same phenomenon, hedge fund activism, takeover bids, and in a sense, stripping out capital from an otherwise productive sector. Now, in the United States, the argument was, if you do this, if you take capital out of big conglomerates, industrial companies, It'll flow away from the Midwest to California. That's what happened, Silicon Valley. Larry Summers, the former US Treasury Secretary, argued in the 2000s that this readjustment was necessary. So you have to have some kind of downsizing and restructuring in the industrial belt in the Midwest to create the capital flow over to Silicon Valley. So maybe that's also true to some extent of the UK, right? If you want a high-tech sector, you need to release capital somewhere. Maybe that's true, but the downside of that, as we see in the United States and to a lesser degree here, this deindustrialization, downsizing, labor shedding has very serious long-term social implications for the country, greater inequality, to some degree erosion of the public space, and the rise of populist and maybe even authoritarian politics is all connected to this with a lag. So these are some of the complications which you see in the case of an economy like the UK, heavily dependent on finance, heavily skewed towards particular sectors, not able to deal so effectively with the question, can we provide stable, long-term, sustainable jobs for our own citizens?
You mentioned this problem of low productivity starting all the way back from the global financial crisis. But since that time, we've had huge technological advances, right? Whether that's the prevalence of smartphones, 5G now, we're in the beginning of this AI sort of revolution. Why hasn't any of that been reflected in this in the productivity figures?
Of course, those productivity figures are really just giving us an overall picture, and they net out a lot of particular effects. And there's no doubt that productivity has been improved in certain sectors, including the public sector, through the advances in digital technology. Of course, every country gets that benefit, more or less, right? There's nothing distinctive about the UK. And you can be a country like the UK where there are advances being made in basic research, in artificial intelligence and machine learning, done here, Cambridge, much of the time, and in London, really big centres now for AI research. But the benefits of that are shared globally, I think. You don't necessarily just have investment locally because the science is done here. So it's partly the net effect that we're observing. But how far are things like digitalisation and improvements in AI reaching the population as a whole? A lot of that is still quite new. Okay, digitalisation isn't, sure. iPhones and things like that, the internet, that's not new at all. But something as revolutionary as AI, we're still seeing that play out. How is that going to benefit communities and also cities outside the Golden Triangle, so-called, of London, Oxford and Cambridge? To take Cambridge as an illustration of this. So Cambridge is, by any standards, a remarkably successful ecosystem for innovation. So we have excellent innovation infrastructure, not just a major university with a huge science base, but also law firms that support venture capital, both based in Cambridge and in London. So we have the institutional infrastructure to make all this work. Cambridge doesn't lack any of that. Right? And Cambridge has thousands and thousands now of smaller firms, medium-sized enterprises, continue to grow year on year. The wider Cambridge region is an extraordinary example of what can be achieved. However, in the Cambridge region itself, despite this growth, we see some downsides. It's very expensive to live in Cambridge, just as it might be in San Francisco. We're seeing pressure placed in the public sector. So even a very successful private sector of the sort we have needs schools, hospitals, and other infrastructure. And it's becoming difficult for key workers to even move and live here. Okay. The tax base is still very small. So basically Cambridge doesn't really have its own tax base. Right? So even if we said in Cambridge, we're producing all this, but we'd like to see this reflected in better local public amenities, improved public transport, it doesn't always come through that way because these decisions are taken nationally. If you go outside the Golden Triangle, of course, there are pockets of extremely successful innovations, not just in the southeast of England. Okay. But why don't we see similar ecosystems across the country as a whole? Partly, I think, because the public investment, which is often complementary to the private sector investment, is very much focused on London and the southeast. And that's a problem. Think about Crossrail, think about Thameslink, the huge public investments in infrastructure in London. Think about Cambridge's biopharma campus near Addenbrooke's Hospital, huge public investment as well as private money flowing in. Why has that not been done elsewhere? It could be. There's nothing that unique about Cambridge. Okay, you might say, well, Cambridge is where this science began. Maybe, okay, but the first computers really in the world were developed in Manchester. And although we claim Alan Turing as a Cambridge graduate, he was based at Manchester University. Okay, that's so much of the work he did. There's nothing that special about Cambridge. You could replicate Cambridge elsewhere. And I think some thought needs to be given to this. Okay, if it's just Cambridge, Oxford, London, and a few other places, then of course the benefits of this very successful model just won't spill over. Now, again, US has the same problem. How do you take Silicon Valley and make that work in Indiana or Nebraska? It's a huge problem. But some thought needs to be given, I think, by policymakers about how to deal with this. You can't just do it through private sector initiative.
I'd like to get your thoughts more about this regionalization part. But first, there was a question from LinkedIn from Christoph, who asked, what about, do you see this labor inequality? Is there a sectoral element to it, right? Do you see the same kind of labor inequality in agriculture versus manufacturing, maybe the financial services sector?
Well, I think if you think about manufacturing, most of those are not low-paid jobs, but there aren't so many jobs in manufacturing itself. Now, that's not unique to the UK. That's around the world. The further an economy develops, the fewer manufacturing jobs it needs, and that's because of improvements in productivity. But those productivity improvements in manufacturing would spill over and create the space for a larger public sector. And that's really what we see. Jobs are created in the public sector, in education and health. Relatively few jobs are needed in manufacturing to create this virtuous circle in the opinion of many people. So it's not a catastrophe that we see productivity improvements leading to a smaller and quite well paid, yes, manufacturing sector over time. But if you take agriculture, that's a very complex story. The UK is heavily dependent on migrant labour for agriculture. And many workers in agriculture receive the basic minimum wage because there's really no collective bargaining in agriculture. The legal minimum wage is needed to provide a living wage at all. It's very complicated. So before Brexit, the UK in agriculture was heavily dependent on workers from other EU member states, particularly in Eastern and Central Europe. After Brexit, the UK has changed its rules about migration, and we now receive migrant labour flows from all around the world. But in many cases, those migrant workers are just receiving the legal minimum wage. So that is, in that sense, a low-paid sector. Now, agriculture is not any longer just a sector where there are hundreds and hundreds or thousands of small farms. A lot of the employers in agriculture are now large-scale and major entities. And that's, again, a trend you see elsewhere in Europe. So what we're seeing here is a very complex story about, since you mentioned it, about agriculture. Why did we become so dependent on migration? Well, there's always been migration into agriculture, but probably only recently has there been such a high degree of reliance on international migration. So at the moment, farms in Cambridgeshire, maybe 5 or 6 years ago, you most likely would have found the workers there might have been coming from Poland or Lithuania. Today, you're most likely to find that a large part of the labour force in East Anglia or Lincolnshire is coming from Central Asia, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan. Now, that wasn't necessarily planned. The UK doesn't specifically target those countries for migration flows, but those flows are happening. And this is an international market. Workers coming from Central Asia can choose where to work, and they have a choice between, for example, Russia, Korea, and the UK or other European countries. That's how it works. It's an international market. And the UK is a highly attractive destination for various reasons for workers who may even be professionals in a country like Kazakhstan or Kyrgyzstan, but can earn 10 times here what they would there. Now, that situation probably won't last forever. I should say, by the way, that there's no real evidence that this is much affecting net migration, because workers from Central Asia normally come here for 6 months and they return home for 6 months and they come back for 6 months. That's how it works. But you might ask yourself the question, why does the UK need to rely upon an international labour force? And if it didn't, would wages in the UK go up? Now, this is a major issue with Brexit, because supporters of Brexit argued that if migration flows were shut down, and you hear this argument a lot, again, in the United States about migration, wages would go up. Well, in theory, yes, if you reduce labour supply, wages might go up. But in practice, wages may not be that elastic. Right? Okay. And what the UK did in response to Brexit was not try to encourage employers to employ people who'd been living in the UK, but they just opened up different international migration routes. So it's a great question, complex answer, sorry. It is an interesting story, yeah. So yeah, sure, inequality varies across sectors, but the UK has many more lower paid workers than other comparable European economies like France or Germany.
I mean, on agriculture, if we think about the US, yes, there's a lot of migrant workers who go and pick strawberries in, say, Florida or California, but the US also has these huge tracts of land that's farmed by out in the Midwest, where it's just a couple of people on a huge tractors. Does that mean that they, as a sector, it's much more productive compared to places like the UK where there'll be much smaller farms, there's more fragmentation?
You see big farms in the UK as well, and that's been a trend. So it is an industry, it is a sector. It's no longer just the smaller farms. UK farming has been like that for a very long time. In fact, again, going back to our history, migration from the countryside into the towns is beginning in the 17th or 18th century. We have an agricultural revolution before we have the industrial one. We've never really had a so-called peasant economy. That hasn't ever really functioned. So the UK has had a modern agrarian sector before even it had a modern manufacturing sector. And in that sense, agriculture is just like any other industry. Yeah, it's run on highly organized way. That's my impression. Yes, there are smaller farms, but actually there's always been a high level of investment in technology. Relatively few workers directly would be needed. Relatively few people working in agriculture in the UK today. That's because of productivity improvements. That's clear. So we probably wouldn't expect to see agriculture absorbing a lot of employment in future. We would expect to see employment in certain areas of manufacturing and also the public sector growing over time. Right, so an advanced economy needs teachers, doctors, nurses, administrators, as well as people working in manufacturing. It's often said the public sector has low productivity compared to the private sector, but the truth is it's very hard to measure productivity in the public sector. And on the whole, if we look at our public sector, it works really well, although it has become too small, probably over the last 10 years thanks to austerity policy. But that was a conscious political choice.
We have a question from Aaron Tate, who asks, what about the logistics industry? Is that an area where certain places like Luton, maybe others in the Midlands and the North, can produce or provide employment?
Well, Luton's interesting, of course, because of its airport and the spillover that generates, which is very important. There's no reason at all why a city like Luton can't flourish. It's near, of course, London and benefits from that, and has many advantages in terms of transport links and everything. Of course, you can't compare directly Luton and Cambridge. They have different histories and trajectories, but there are universities in and near Luton which are also very helpful. So again, and that's just one example, isn't it, of how you can have advantages from agglomeration in a particular town. Clustering of both the public sector and the private sector, I think, is really important. What I think we need to get away from is the idea that public sector investment always crowds out private sector investment. Okay, the airport's a good example. I think it's owned by the local borough, isn't it, in the case of Luton? So public sector investment can often bring in private sector investment. It should be seen as a virtuous cycle, I think, rather than public money crowding out private money. Again, Cambridge's biopharma campus and all that sort of thing. Public-private partnerships, that's the way to think about public investment, I think. Public expenditure is often investment, right? Okay, and should be seen that way and as generating a return.
We also have a question from Pavan, who asks, what kind of economy is more resilient to external shocks? So is there an ideal ratio between manufacturing and services?
Well, if you think about the UK in the 80s, for example, or 70s, probably at that point, the UK was vulnerable because it had large manufacturing or production-based industries and coal, steel, shipbuilding. And they were subjected to a huge shock, of course, recessions in the 1970s and technological change, and the downsizing that resulted. But of course, other countries also had large similar sectors and weathered that shock better. So it's not just a question, I think, of whether you have services or manufacturing. I think it's a question of your institutional arrangements, including corporate governance, for weathering this process. Now, economists might disagree about whether you need to reallocate away from a shrinking sector, as manufacturing was here in the 80s, or whether you can somehow revive and maintain that sector, as happened in France and Germany at the same point. I think it's a little bit too simple to say where you see a declining sector, you need to direct investment away from that and put it into something you think is new and coming along, because that can also be a mistake. So if you take the Cambridge example, people have argued that Cambridge is very resilient as a city because it has a very flexible labour market in a sense. It doesn't have just one or two big firms. It has hundreds and hundreds of smaller firms. And that, in a sense, is a source of resilience. Highly volatile and flexible and mobile labour force, people moving around between jobs, although it's not quite like Silicon Valley, but people are very mobile here. So that kind of flexibility, people value that. It seems positive. But on the other hand, Cambridge can be just as vulnerable as any other region to a fundamental shock in the world economy. High inflation, geopolitical events outside the country, conflict overseas but nearby, as in the case of Ukraine. Who knows what will happen next? These things can affect an economy. And the question then might be, what are your institutions for social resilience as much as economic resilience? You need means to protect, I think, societies against some of the implications of very rapid technological change or change driven by external events. If you don't have those, that spills over into some of the things we're seeing, fragmentation of the infrastructure of the country and also increasing polarization of politics and culture. So I think resilience is really an issue, I agree with you, but just making everything more flexible won't necessarily make it more resilient. It could make it more breakable and more fragile. Just because something has been very successful, as a Cambridge phenomenon has been for the last 30 or 40 years, doesn't mean it will just simply continue.
I'm going to put you on the spot, Simon. So what are some sectors in the UK economy that you think are probably quite vulnerable at the moment?
Well, maybe sector I know well, law, is a little bit vulnerable, and so is finance because of Brexit. I think one implication of Brexit is it's a major regulatory change. So people talk about trade and they talk about migration, but the integration of the UK into a broader regulatory and institutional structure, which was the EU, didn't just help trade to flow, it also helped to modernise the UK legal sector and financial sector. Now, this was a great advantage for the UK. Other European countries were also exposed to some of the flexible common law techniques used here. So I think that was a case of mutual advantage, actually. With the UK no longer being in the EU or even in the customs union or single market, over time, there's likely to be a separation of English law from the mainland European tradition that was becoming merged with. And I'm not sure that's a great advantage for English law. You may say English law is used globally, but actually much of that was through the EU. Finance, again, we're seeing financial flows out of the UK into mainland Europe, and we're also seeing a large reallocation of employment from London to Frankfurt and Paris and other financial centres. That doesn't help, I think. That's not a desirable aspect of Brexit. You can't simply relocate those jobs to a more global orientation. Trade deals with countries outside the EU have largely just replicated existing arrangements and don't offer much of an advantage going forward. The World Trade Organization is becoming defunct as a body because it's not able to agree a multilateral trade agreement of a new kind, and instead we're seeing bilateral trading arrangements between countries replacing multilateralism. The UK is outside the loop when it comes to the agreements the EU is making with a large range of countries, for example, in Southeast Asia and also in Africa. That's a problem. So institutionally, I'd say law is vulnerable. If we think about the universities as a sector, which we should do, they operate as businesses increasingly. Again, think about what Brexit has done. Fewer students applying from mainland Europe, a change in the composition of our student base, and reducing opportunities universities had to recruit internationally to maintain their own budgets and balance sheets. The migration debate has led to a reduction in the availability of visas for students coming into the UK from overseas. So the university sector is less internationalised and less globalised than it was because of Brexit. And we in the university system know very well what the consequences are. Severe short-term pressures on budgets, maybe not so much in Cambridge, but even we are being affected by this. Certainly outside Cambridge is visibly affecting the feasibility of the growth strategy universities have had. Now, you may say the university is just part of the public sector. What are they really doing? But actually, the UK's university sector is a huge supplier of employment, well-paid employment and good employment on the whole, I would say, and also a major source of exports, actually, and has done a huge amount of good for the country in terms of soft power over the years. So something which affects the university sector, I don't think, in that sense, can possibly be regarded as beneficial, and that's one very severe effect of Brexit.
We have a question from someone on LinkedIn about what's your thoughts on the role of the US and its impact on the UK economy?
Well, the UK affects all economies. It's so important.
Sorry, the US.
Yes.
I think he's asking about the US elections and the impact of the US on the UK economy.
Absolutely. So what happens in the US affects every country, and it affects us particularly because of our close institutional ties to the US, our common language, which means we've always to some degree been tied into US models of production, I would say. Again, US a bit like us, very successful in finance and law, but a much bigger and much more sustainable manufacturing sector in the US than we have here. Hugely successful large companies and the supply chains that go with them, and domestically owned. So we have big companies in the UK in a sector like automobiles, which are foreign owned. They're important for local supply chains, but the decisions are going to be taken elsewhere. So the upcoming election, what will that mean for the US? Probably the election will be most important when it comes to social policy issues and institutional stability, rather than for the economy. So if you look at what happened when Donald Trump was president, a populist president, did he change economic policy? No, not fundamentally. Did the US economy change? No. Researchers have found very little evidence of a kind of Trump effect on the way that the US economy was working. It didn't fundamentally diverge from its previous growth pattern or model. And I rather imagine the same would happen again if Trump won. There wouldn't be a fundamental change to the economy. And if Harris won, we might imagine it would continue in more or less the same vein as it has been under Biden. But there are some continuities between Trump and Biden. Both of them have shifted US policy towards China. Both of them have been a little bit less keen on globalization, I would say. There's been some reorientation of the US's position on international trade, with NAFTA being replaced by the US-Mexico-Canada trade agreement, which is much more protective of American manufacturing. Biden's industrial policy appears to many in Europe to be very protectionist and to put a question mark over Europe's own industrial policy. It doesn't really have one, but maybe it should do if Japan, America are behaving in a much more protectionist, defensive way about protecting their local industries. Now, that's going to continue, I think, under either Trump or Harris. I don't see there being a fundamental difference there. So beneath the level of the rhetoric, US policy has already begun to change to be less orientated towards globalization. Now, where that leaves Europe and where it leaves the UK, a really big question mark, I think, because we might be out in the cold. And the UK even more so because it's not part of the EU and won't benefit from joint decision-making. A big problem for the EU, though, is I think a lack of an industrial policy. It's very, very difficult for them to reorientate away from being a single market and common customs zone to having something which a nation state would have, an industrial policy. They don't really have a centralized budget. They have a central currency, which lacks other flanking institutions. So big questions there for the EU, for sure. Now, for the UK, I find it very hard to believe that we can forge a completely autonomous route forward here without thinking about what other European countries are doing, even if it doesn't mean going back into the EU in the short or even the medium term. So I suspect we'll begin to take our lead to a certain degree from what they're doing. And that I think will increasingly be the case, even if it's not publicly stated that we're shadowing them in some way. We'll be adopting many of their rules and regulations in order to trade and maintaining features of their model, which we've already adopted, but without having any say in how those regulations are made. That's the downside of Brexit. We're no longer able to have an input into the making of rules, which in practice affect us, even if we're not formally bound by them. Now, that's probably actually good for the EU because the UK was obstructing a lot of integrationist measures, which are really needed for the EU's future. The UK is out of the picture. I happen to think that Brexit is a huge benefit for the EU. As a European, I think it's positive actually. As a British citizen, I think it's very negative. Partly for this reason, we're losing influence.
Our Peter on YouTube asks, what kind of talent or skills does the UK economy hope to attract or to build to address sustainable growth?
Well, I think we are already putting a lot of investment into AI, actually, which is good. And we have a fantastic science base for that. We have a very large number of very successful computer science departments and high-tech companies clustered around, again, to a degree, the south of England, but there are other clusters too. So I would hope there will be continuing investment in that. And also in the ancillary financial and legal services that we need to make that work. I think that should be a priority for the incoming government. I was sorry to see, however, that the new Labour government has really cancelled a major AI project at Edinburgh University to build a faster supercomputer for AI. I honestly find it hard to see how that decision makes sense, because it would ultimately have paid for itself, although it was a very significant investment, around £500 million. So these are really important issues. Are we going to have a government which, notwithstanding the issue of public sector deficits, is willing to invest for the longer term in this critically important area? I think that's a bit of an open question after what happened 2 weeks ago.
Related to this, we have someone on LinkedIn asking, what's your thoughts on AI playing a bigger role in the UK economy? So in areas of automation, in manufacturing, or even healthcare?
It already is, of course. I've been researching AI for the past 4 or 5 years in the legal sector. So we see adoption of machine learning and legal AI, law tech so-called, for document retrieval, but also client advice. And conceivably, we see automated decision-making, although I think there are probably serious issues about how far you can automate judicial decision-making. But we already see this in other respects. We see automated decision-making in the public sector. There are dangers here, actually, in using machine learning in a relatively crude way, but those dangers are known about, are written about, and the risks are being assessed. AI is already happening, so it's not going to go away. There needs to be a robust debate about when it should be used and when it should not be used. It shouldn't be used for everything. Again, for example, we need to inform ourselves better about what AI is, how it works, and what it really is. When, for example, experts on AI a few years ago said, very soon nobody is going to need to train to be a radiologist because we can replace radiology with AI, what happened was that fewer people did train to be radiologists. That's a perfectly rational decision. It turned out, of course, this wasn't the case, and we still need radiologists to interpret what AI technologies are doing in this area. So there's a real danger that false messages are sent, or we misunderstand what's happening. There's a great deal of focus on long-term existential risks arising from AI, mostly encouraged by people like Elon Musk, right? Or short-term. The dangers are much more short-term than that. Use of AI, for example, in our own universal credit system and in other benefit welfare systems is dangerous, potentially, because AI makes mistakes. And we know from the Siri scandal in the Netherlands that use of AI to identify welfare fraud, for example, is a very, very dangerous route, because often it doesn't work well. Data contain biases. I think we're familiar now with this problem of garbage in, garbage out. Over-reliance on technology, which we don't understand. People think it's some kind of magic. It isn't. Right? Okay, but understanding what it does seems to me to be critical. There needs to be a public debate about this. Right? Okay. So AI could be tremendously helpful in the public sector, but we need to inform ourselves and educate ourselves and move away from this technological determinism or tech solutionism. Because every time there's a problem, tech is the answer. Well, sometimes tech is a problem. So I just plead here for a more balanced understanding of what AI is doing.
And we have a question from Aniruddha. I think it's kind of related to this, which is, can the UK learn lessons from Germany regarding manufacturing, maybe countries like South Korea, where there's very high automation? Is this the magic bullet, silver bullet for increasing productivity?
Well, I think that it's a bit late to turn the clock back and for the UK to adopt a policy, as in Germany, of promoting the middle stand firms, medium-sized engineering firms. Very difficult to replicate what South Korea did in the 1970s and 1980s, because we've moved away from that model. I don't think moving to heavy industry is going to be feasible for us. However, we must at least maintain the very important manufacturing base that we've got in areas like chemicals, which are so important to us, pharma. We don't want to lose that. We really shouldn't be losing our last remaining steel producer. That's an extremely, in my view, unwise decision. If only geopolitically, it's very unwise not to have a domestic producer of steel. So we don't want our manufacturing base to shrink anymore, but I don't think we can be exactly like Germany. Germany has its own comparative strengths. The Mittelstand firms are one, but weaknesses in other areas. They're not as strong as we are in finance or services, and maybe not even in things like AI, which are coming along the road.
And I think we have time for one final question from someone on LinkedIn. What can developing economies like India learn from the UK's experience over the past 30, 40 years?
Well, that's a great question. Thank you. I've researched in India and also in China, and I think if we're talking about India, that would be another talk. But I think India has a number of strategic choices to make about its industrial policy, and also about its institutional policy and its training policy and its attitude towards human capital and social capital. Actually, I'm not sure India has much to learn from the UK or Europe, but there's a great deal to learn from other middle-income countries. And there are very distinct growth paths in Asia at the moment. East Asia, Southeast Asia is one such path. South Asia is absolutely another path. India has a lot to learn, perhaps from other South Asian countries like Bangladesh, about the need for institutional infrastructural investment, and also from some of its other neighbouring countries, including Pakistan, which is in the process of revising its labour laws at the moment. India's also had that debate, but has largely left its labour laws as they were, but with some formal changes. So this is a whole other talk, I think. What can India do? I think that the growth model they've adopted is actually similar to the UK's in some respects, but they want to avoid ending up with some of the same problems: a large precarious economy, a large informal one, and a lack of social cohesion. These are risks and dangers for any economy. China has avoided those dangers by and large, but maybe has other issues, including being, it has to be said, sure, not a liberal democracy. I think that's clear, and China wouldn't claim to be. Okay, so there are pros and cons to those routes, but there are very, very different developmental models in the world today.
Finally, Simon, a very lightning question would be, what's your one wish for the new British Prime Minister and the Cabinet when it comes to the economy for the next 5 years?
Treat public expenditure as investment, and see public investment as crowding in, helping private investment, not crowding it out.
Well, thank you so much, Simon. And I'm sure the PM and the Cabinet are watching, so hopefully they pick that up for you. And
Thanks
thank
so
you
much.
all. Thank you for the viewers as well. The balance sheet will be back on the 13th of September, same time, 12:45 to 1:30. We'll have Akshay Sama, CFO of Axio and an alum from CJBS. Akshay will talk about the role of the CFO in a fast-growing startup. So till then, stay safe and see you next time.